So hi everyone. Welcome to our second speaker series, speaker event of the new school year. I hope you're all well, and thank you all for logging in tonight, despite what's happening, with our downstairs neighbors. It's great to see so many familiar faces and also familiar names and new ones as well. Before we start, I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge that the territory the Wilson Institute for Canadian History sits on is a traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. And as I've been saying these past months for our online speaker event, we are meeting here today in a virtual setting. I'd like to invite you all to reflect on the territories that you reside on. And all of us at the Wilson Institute are committed to the fight against racism and support those that are demanding justice for racialized and discriminated against people around the world. Now, today's talk is part of a general series called Racialized People and Democracy. We have an incredible lineup of events coming up, so please do check our website for more details and a list of speakers. You can find it, just Google Wilson Institute for Canadian History and you can search Visiting Speakers section. Now, it's my pleasure today to welcome once again to the Wilson Institute, Dr. Funké Aladejebi. Dr. Aladejebi is a professor of history at the University of Toronto. She specializes in 20th century Black Canadian history with a focus on oral history, the history of education in Canada, Black Canadian women's history, and transnationalism. Her forthcoming book titled Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers, which will be published with the Wilson series at McGill Queen's University Press, explores the importance of Black Canadian women in sustaining their communities and preserving a distinct Black identity within restrictive gender and racial barriers. Today, she'll present a paper titled Seeing Themselves, Race, Education, and Black Life in Canada. Following Dr. Aladejebi's talk, we will have a brief Q&A period that I will do my best to facilitate. And now, without further ado, Dr. Funké Aladejebi.
Yeah, thank you. I love that we're doing like digital claps. This is amazing. Okay, I'm gonna get ready to share my presentation and then start. Okay, looks like it's visible to everyone. Wonderful. Okay, so thank you so much to the Wilson Institute and for Max for inviting me to be part of this visiting speaker series. It is my hope that this program functions as part of a series of ongoing projects across the discipline of Canadian history that not only acknowledges the experiences of Black Canadians, but also considers the continuous work produced by scholars of Black Canada as part of, and of course, an important contribution to the field and discipline of history. On September 30th, 2016, Peel Region police officers were called to a public school in Mississauga after a teacher claimed a Black child at the school was assaulting students and staff members. Officers would later approach the 6-year-old child, carry her to the office, and handcuff her wrists and ankles to a chair. After this, officers later laid the child on her stomach and handcuffed her hands behind her back until the child's mother arrived. The child's mother later filed a human rights complaint against the Peel Region Police Services Board, and in February 2020, the Ontario Human Rights Commission ruled that race was a factor in police treatment of the young child. In November 2017, a school principal at a popular art school in Etobicoke, Ontario, was transferred to another school after it was discovered that the principal was keeping a list of all the Black students attending the art school. Categorizing students under cultural signifiers, including African and Caribbean, the principal compiled a list of Black students and began circulating this list to teachers until finally one educator took a picture of this list and shared it with students. Amidst accusations of racial discrimination, the principal indicated that the list was intended to address achievement gaps among students and apologized as this was an inappropriate approach. The TDSB later approved the principal's transfer request despite student demands for a stronger penalty. And just 2 weeks ago, a University of Ottawa professor apologized after using the N-word during an online class and said she believed the ensuing controversy was blown out of proportion, citing that, quote, "If I knew that word should not be spoken in the context of an academic course, I would have tried to find another way. That's clear," end quote. The professor claimed to not have realized that she may have hurt some of her students and thought it would be acceptable to use this word in an academic context. As details of the event generated widespread media attention, Black students called for systemic change on campus, reflecting a broader undercurrent of racial bias at the university. These three stories reflect the pervasiveness of anti-Black racism at all levels of schooling and education in Canada. They are often represented in mainstream media and public discourses as controversies or isolated instances, often blamed on one individual within these institutions, rather than on an embedded culture of Canadian schooling that disproportionately leaves Black students at a disadvantage. The title of my talk today speaks to some of these contradictions, even as we continue to witness increasing dialogue around anti-Black racism and systemic change. The structures that dramatically affect Black life and well-being increasingly remain intact. Instead, I argue, as do many scholars of Black Canada, that this increasing conversation around violence at the hands of state officials is not a recent or new phenomenon, but instead part of a long and complicated history. One that articulates the character of Canada as one that props up conversations of racial inclusion as a veneer to cloak the ever-present nature of systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism and violence. Another part of my conversation today also hopes to give space to the long-standing history of Black activism through education in Canada, as a way of considering the moments when persons of African descent appear in mainstream conversations about racial justice in Canada. While the three stories that I mentioned earlier reflect experiences of anti-Black racism in real time, they also indicate the ways in which Black activism and advocacy has consistently stood to challenge these institutional practices of racism. It is here that I'd like to make connections with our present moment and its connections to the historical past. Elements of this presentation today stem from my forthcoming book, Schooling the System, A History of Black Women Teachers, as Max mentioned earlier, which explores Black women teachers' experiences in the 20th century as profoundly shaped by long-standing tensions around professionalism, gender, race, segregated labor markets, and social justice activism. Much like today, Black women's experiences were varied, and they were not always in agreement on what kinds of activism can be implemented in Black communities. But the juncture where women's radical and moderate philosophies met was usually around education. Education has long been understood in Black Canadian communities as a way to facilitate economic and social mobility. And despite ongoing systemic discrimination and challenges that face these very communities, it continues to be a key battleground for persons of African descent in Canada. And significant to this conversation are the ways in which Black women teachers functioned as professional educators and cultural mediators for Black Canadian communities. And perhaps one of the most pervasive elements to consider when writing about the history of education in Canada is to explore the ways in which Black Canadian women were both hypervisible as minority educators and also invisible on account to school curriculum that largely ignored the presence and the contributions of Blacks in Canada. In fact, in the moments when persons of African descent do appear in our public discourse, we often are seeing a fragmented and liminal representations of who they are. These representations often position Black Canadians as the internal others who become hypervisible when accused of transgression, and discussions of Blackness are often constructed as foreign, right? So if we think, for example, about this earlier case of the 6-year-old child who was handcuffed, you see that she emerges in this moment, not just as a child, but as a child who was problematic, who was enacting violence in these kinds of ways. And so this allows the nation state to think of and discuss Blackness in ways that are obscured, or at least that obscure the social, economic, and political conditions that disadvantaged persons of African descent in the first place. And in the 1950s and 1960s, when Black women gained increasing positions in schools in Canada, the Black women teachers that I talked to found that they often encountered an education system and Eurocentric curriculum that largely ignored the early presence of Blacks in Canada and illustrated racist and stereotypical notions of Africa and its descended peoples. This Eurocentric curriculum often denied Black experiences and contributions in Canada, situated all knowledges or knowledge production as white and Western, and represented Africa and the Caribbean as static, unchanging, foreign, and backwards. The absence of Black knowledge in Canadian school curricula has been described by many scholars of Black Canada as a willful ignorance and aggression towards Blacks. School curricula played a crucial role in the creation and recreation of ideological hegemony, where Black Canadian knowledge was ignored, devalued, and unnurtured as a valid source of expertise or knowledge. Canada's exclusionary curriculum often represented Blacks, if it did at all, as incapable and inferior. And in fact, Ontario textbooks reflected these mainstream ideals where racialized peoples were either eliminated from or represented as auxiliary participants in the construction and development of the Canadian nation. So situating Blacks as foreign and distinctly different from what it meant to be Canadian, school textbooks and curriculum plans across Ontario, and I would argue the broader nation, Canada, continued to negatively represent persons of African descent. And while we often consider these experiences as outdated and antiquated in Canadian society, Ontario Black History's recent publication campaign or public awareness campaign titled Blacked Out History actually revealed that out of the 255 pages in a grade 8 Ontario textbook, only 13 pages covered Black history. And so this reveals the incremental and often fragmented ways in which Ontario's curriculum has been reactionary rather than proactively documenting Black Canadian experiences. And Black women educators begin to understand the complex negotiations that they have to make within an education system that largely ignores their presence, but also welcomes them under specific reasons. And I'll talk about one of those now. In the mid-20th century, Black educators in Canadian schools were often considered to be cultural brokers who would act as go-betweens that would connect Black, and at times, and at this moment, it was largely the Caribbean community, but not exclusively. And so they would connect Black communities, parents, with this predominantly white school system. As a result of growing concerns about racial tensions that were happening across schools in Ontario, and I'm specifically talking about schools in urban centers, including Toronto, Montreal, Windsor. And so school boards and administrators actively sought out Black women teachers and their assumed expertise in dealing with changing classroom dynamics in Canadian schools. Given that racial and gender constructions of labor viewed Black women as caregivers and nurturers, and they were perceived to be natural teachers, they became the most accessible and available option to school administrators. Ultimately, school officials looked towards trained educators who were believed to have both the expertise and, of course, the cultural understanding as the best solution to address their growing Black student problem. Black women's greater numbers in Ontario's schools and their training in Canada made them the ideal cultural mediators, and we can talk a little bit later about what that means. But ultimately, administrators assumed that only visible minority educators could relate to racially diverse non-white students, and this relieved mainstream administrators from the responsibility of creating systemic changes that mandated that all educators actively work to create inclusive classrooms. Instead, the responsibility of inclusivity was placed on the shoulders of individual racialized educators, and particularly Black women. The need for Black teachers spoke to these mainstream racial stereotypes that viewed Black students as different and outsiders in need of educators of their own kind to complete school programming. The prevailing idea here was that only certain racialized educators could teach racial minority students, and this reinforced this outsider status for both students and educators, and conceptions that Blackness was a problem foreign to white educators and administrators, and something that could only be solved by Blacks. Because mainstream administrators were unable or sometimes even unwilling to deal with Black students, Black women educators were strongly pursued in the 1950s and 1960s to fill out these requirements, particularly in school systems. This process would also explain the trend of Black women who are moving out of rural areas and their local communities, and were actually gaining jobs in urban centers where employment was often more difficult to obtain. This also impacted the communities from which these women came, in that Black teachers moved out of their communities in pursuit of economic and social advancement, and these areas were often left without the sufficient numbers of educators necessary to sustain and support their communities. And so as a result of all of this, programs that were created were largely geared towards Black students in the 1960s and 1970s, were predominantly spearheaded by and created as a result of the advocacy work of Black community members and Black educators within the system. However, the implementation of these various programs did not necessarily mean that educators this implementation did not necessarily mean that their effects on Black students were always positive, because many Black students continue to experience high dropout rates and disillusionment with the schools. The ministry's reactionary implementation of initiatives meant that it often offered inconsistent programming, planning, and that it varied from school to school rather than offering a permanent system-wide change. So it's why you will see, active programs for minority students in somewhere like Toronto, and you might find this more sporadic in an area like London, Ontario, right? That there is no kind of broader way of implementing and changing the curriculum, that it becomes this sporadic way of really implementing band-aid solutions to a larger systemic problem. And so as a result, the ministry's response really focused on teacher-led advocacy. And this was also a double-edged sword. And by this, I mean that while the absence of these programs brought increased criticisms from minority communities, their ability to curb dropout rates amongst Black students meant that a more comprehensive and inclusive program was necessary. So, the ministry would often implement these very small programs that were often short-lived, and they placed that responsibility usually on Black community members and Black educators to kind of continue and sustain them, when in actuality, broader systematic changes were necessary. And so while the ministry continued to face social and political pressure to address issues of inclusivity within its schools, the inefficient ways that it sought to manage the concerns often left Black teachers, parents, and pupils further marginalized. This constant reevaluation of schooling and the numerous reports that were issued by community organizations and school boards, which were encouraged by social movements of the 1960s and 1970s, did highlight a recognition that some of these schools and the school boards needed help. However, they expected to find this help through the numbers of Black women that were sprinkled throughout their school systems. Largely concerned with the inability of Black students to relate to the school curriculum, administrators thought that hiring Black educators rather than making systemic change would be the easiest, cheapest, and least disruptive approach. As a consequence, one important strategic response by school authorities was to hire Black women to serve these roles, not only as educators, but also as cultural mediators who could supposedly solve the issues of student disengagement. And this also becomes a contemporary problem when we think through the advocacy and push for the few, or the responsibility that gets pushed on the few Black educators in these school systems to facilitate, right, racial inclusion in their schools. And this continues, if you think through the problems or the recent problems that are happening in the Peel District School Board, for those of you who are in Ontario, you'll see very specifically that the responsibility still seems to lie on Black women and Black educators to make these changes. And yet, despite these challenges, Black women teachers sought to build their own professional careers while also serving their communities. Having experienced their own forms of exclusion and discrimination within school systems, Black women teachers worked to prepare all students for the contradictions in an education system that excluded some racial minorities from equal access and opportunity. And I found in my research that many Black women teachers in this study infused other mothering practices within student learning. So this often disrupted mainstream ideals that viewed children as private property, and Black women used other mothering practices to create women-centered networks and a reclamation of community-based learning. These pedagogical approaches were used not only to educate all children, but they were specifically geared to prepare Black students for the racially rooted challenges that lay ahead. This pedagogy then was sensitive to the presence and history and the needs of Black Canadians, and it often subverted mainstream notions that silenced African descended peoples and limited their opportunities in academic institutions. Scholars in the United States indicate that African American teachers who utilized a similar approach were often considered to be warm demanders. And so warm demanders were teachers who would provide a tough-minded, no-nonsense, structured and disciplined classroom environment for kids in society who were psychologically and physically abandoned. Fernita Ware also argues that warm demanders were Black teachers who were successful with racialized students because they did not lower academic standards and used culturally responsive teaching to support their students. As such, while Black women's pedagogical approaches seemed to have a limited impact on the broader curriculum changes, this connection to Black communities distinctly characterized Black women's resistive and transformative pedagogies. Although although on the surface, Black women's teaching practice may have appeared to be conservative by their very nature of being kind of connected to mainstream ideals and focused on inclusion, they were also radically subversive for the work on social transformation. Some Black women, in fact, used their authority and position within schools to better prepare pupils for the social and systemic oppression that they would face, while also transforming immediate social conditions, especially by creating a safe space and a secure classroom for students. And this, in many ways, enriched Black Canadian communities and the experiences of these students in the classroom. Black women's expectations were adapted or were considering their students and their communities in ways that suggested cultural sensitivity and empowered students holistically to consider their intellectual, emotional, and social well-being. While Black women teachers were also in their individual classrooms advocating on behalf of Black and racialized students, they were also participating in a broader social movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And the boundaries between community and schooling institutions were often blurred for Black women teachers and instead reflected a symbiotic relationship that informed Black women's teaching approaches and remained connected to wider community issues. They were part of this growing movement of Black internationalism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And scholars of Black Canada, including David Austin, who predominantly write on the Sir George Williams protest, also situate this significance of Black internationalism as influencing Blacks in Ontario and other parts of Canada. Austin describes this moment as a vision of Black nationality that imagines Blackness as part of a global population of citizens, a scattered nation that was often embedded in, but also transcended geographic boundaries. So this shared experience of racialization and racism in the Americas deeply impacted Black Canadians who imagined themselves as part of a stateless nation comprising both of continental Africa and its diaspora. As such, Black radical experiences, while gaining notoriety and publicity in the United States as an American manifestation, was also a global phenomenon. And as an extension of this increasing internationalism, Black Canadians remained closely connected to the Black American experience. This growing awareness of radical Black experiences in the United States became part of the Canadian psyche and influenced Black Canadian communities throughout the province. It was also manifested in earlier in the century through political movements such as Garveyism, the Harlem Renaissance, and a growing influence of Pan-Africanism and Black power in the late 1960s. All of this reflected a Black international influence that was fluid and transnational in nature, but also dramatically influenced Black Canadian mobilizing in the late 1960s and 1970s. And such was the case of the Black Education Project, which was created in 1969 to build strong Black communities in Canada. I found that many of the Black women that I spoke to in my research were heavily involved in this organization. And although the organization's mandate was meant to mobilize community members to fight against racism on all spheres, they focused more specifically on policing and schools. And it's not by accident that this continues to be a conversation that we have today. The Black Education Project called for community rallies and meetings. They served as representatives for governing bodies surrounding local issues. And they also lent support to various issues and struggles across Africa, the United States, and the Caribbean. It's also important to note here that the BEP was mainly mobilized by young people in the community. And so BEP had volunteers from the Black Students Union at the University of Toronto, the Black People's Movement at York University, and about this is that even as the Black Education Project was promoting often the missing pieces in Ontario's curriculum, they were also connected to this broader conversation of Blackness as a globally connected community. And so their mechanisms for thinking through advocacy were absolutely different, but education seemed to be something that connected all of these kind of various communities together. So as activists and academics, many of us know that Canada has its own legacy of slavery, colonialism, de facto segregation, and state surveillance. For Black Canadians in particular, anti-Blackness has impacted many facets of our lives, including spatial organization, economic opportunities, and access to education. As a result of Canada's legacy of subtle and sophisticated racism, Black Canadians equally have to deal with housing segregation, higher rates of unemployment, relatively lower annual incomes, acute underrepresentation in high status occupations, subtle and overt forms of discrimination in the workforce and education, and routinely reported incidences of harassment, verbal abuse, and physical assault at the hands of the police. And while all ethnic and racial groups have found themselves placed differently in Canada's narrative of belonging, this process has consistently been constituted through forgetfulness, coercion, erasure, and various forms of privilege and subordination. Consequently, the stories that we tell about Canada has always been a site for struggle in which racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, has become so naturalized and pervasive in our national imaginary that it is often invisible to those who are not adversely impacted by state-sanctioned practices. Presently, Ontario has made some gains in restructuring its ideas of inclusive education by shifting its gaze from a focus on multicultural education to anti-racist education. Unlike earlier educational approaches, this focus is intended to remove institutional barriers that seek to limit racial and ethno-cultural minorities within its school boards. In addition, greater priorities have been given to hiring racially diverse staff, anti-racism advisors and consultants, and practical ways to implement equitable practices in the classroom. However, by their very nature, the ministry responses to Black students indicate a much more complex story of disconnected spaces where intentions often contradict the actual experiences of students inside Canadian schools. Until our education system continues to react rather than to create proactive measures towards integrated and equitable education, Black students will continue to experience disengagement within our schools. I hope that parts of today's conversation encourages us to rethink the historical and present responses that we've had and continue to make for diverse student populations, but also that it helps you think about the ways that educational access has always been led from the community and is open to systemic change. Thank you.
you.